The January blizzard swept through Cedar Falls with a merciless hand, burying the streets under layers of ice and snow. Most residents huddled safely indoors, unaware that on those same frozen streets, a Labrador puppy, no older than 6 months, fought against the storm. His fur, once golden and bright, was now crusted with ice. But as he limped forward, something else caught his attention. A faint, desperate mew from beneath a snow-covered bench. What followed wasn't just a story of survival, but of compassion and courage, as one small act of warmth ignited hope in the most unforgiving of nights.
The January wind howled through the empty streets of Cedar Falls, Minnesota, carrying with it the bitter sting of winter's fury. Snow had been falling relentlessly for hours, transforming the small town into a ghostly landscape of white. The local weather station had issued severe warnings about the approaching blizzard, urging residents to stay indoors and secure their homes. As darkness descended, the temperature plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, making every breath painful and every moment outside potentially lethal. Amid this unforgiving weather, a young Labrador puppy named Buddy trudged through the deepening snow. His golden fur, usually bright and lustrous, was matted with ice and snow. Just 6 months old, he had escaped from a negligent owner's backyard 3 days ago, driven by hunger and the instinct to find somewhere warmer. His paw pads were cracked and bleeding from the frozen ground, leaving faint pink traces in the pristine white snow with each labored step. Buddy had been born into a loving home, but his original family had been forced to give him up due to financial hardship. The second family, who had adopted him from the local shelter, had seemed kind at first. However, they left him outside most of the time, forgetting to provide adequate shelter or regular meals. The memory of warm hands and gentle voices from his first family haunted him, making his current situation even more unbearable. As he limped past the town's deserted park, a faint sound caught his attention. Despite his exhaustion, his ears perked up, and he turned his head toward the source. There, beneath a snow-covered bench, came the weakest of mews. Buddy's natural instinct as a retriever kicked in, and he cautiously approached the bench, his nose working overtime to process the new scent through the numbing cold. Huddled in a soggy cardboard box was a tiny kitten, no more than 8 weeks old. Her fur, which might have been white and gray under normal circumstances, was dirty and wet. She was shivering violently, her small body curled into a tight ball in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. Next to her lay 2 other kittens, already still and cold, claimed by the merciless weather. The surviving kitten, whom we'll come to know as Daisy, had been part of a feral litter born behind the local diner. The restaurant's owner had been leaving food out for the mother cat, but she had disappeared 2 days ago, likely fallen victim to the harsh weather or a predator. The kittens, too young to fend for themselves, had been slowly succumbing to the elements one by one. Buddy's young heart, despite his own desperate situation, couldn't ignore the kitten's plight. He remembered the warmth of his mother's fur, the comfort of huddling with his littermates. Without hesitation, he gently gripped the cardboard box with his teeth and dragged it out from under the bench. The kitten was too weak to protest or run away. Using his nose, Buddy nudged the nearly frozen kitten closer to his body. His own temperature was dangerously low, but he still had more warmth to offer than the wet cardboard. The kitten, driven by pure survival instinct, pressed herself against his chest, burrowing into his thick fur. Buddy curled his body around her, creating a small shelter from the howling wind. They needed to find proper shelter, and soon. Buddy could feel his strength waning, and the tiny creature pressed against him was growing weaker by the minute. He began walking again, this time with even more urgency, though each step felt like moving through molasses. The kitten remained tucked against him, occasionally letting out a weak mew that spurred him to keep going. 3 blocks away, in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, Mark Anderson sat in his favorite armchair, staring absently at the crackling fireplace. At 62, the retired firefighter had spent most of his life saving others, but now his days were marked by an emptiness he couldn't quite shake. His wife, Sarah, had passed away 2 years ago after a brief but fierce battle with cancer, leaving him alone in the house they'd shared for 3 decades. Their children, both successful professionals living on opposite coasts, called regularly but rarely visited. The holidays were particularly difficult, and this winter had been the loneliest yet. Mark had considered getting a pet. Sarah had always wanted a dog, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the fear of opening his heart again, of caring for another living being only to lose them. The wind rattled the windows of his home, and Mark pulled his cardigan tighter around his shoulders. The weather reminded him of a particularly brutal night 20 years ago when his fire crew had rescued a family trapped in their car during a similar blizzard. The satisfaction of saving lives had made the job worthwhile, giving him purpose and meaning. Now, in retirement, he felt adrift. Outside, Buddy's strength was failing. The kitten had grown quiet, and her shivering had become less violent, a dangerous sign. The young dog's vision was beginning to blur, but through the swirling snow, he spotted a warm glow. It was the light from Mark's living room window, spilling out onto the snow-covered lawn like a beacon of hope. With the last of his energy, Buddy dragged himself toward the house. The porch steps might as well have been a mountain, but somehow he managed to climb them, the kitten still pressed against his chest. Once on the porch, his legs finally gave out, and he collapsed against the front door with a soft thud. Mark, lost in his memories, almost missed the sound, but years of training had honed his instincts, and something made him turn his head toward the entrance. He listened intently, and there it was again, a faint scratching sound, barely audible over the howling wind. Rising from his chair, Mark approached the door cautiously. Living alone, he learned to be careful about unexpected visitors, especially at night. He flipped on the porch light and peered through the peephole, but the angle didn't show him what was making the noise. Against his better judgment, but following the instinct that had served him well throughout his career, he opened the door. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. A young Labrador, covered in snow and ice, lay collapsed on his porch. But what truly caught his attention was the tiny kitten the dog was desperately trying to protect, tucked against its body and barely moving. "Dear God," Mark whispered, his firefighter training kicking in immediately. Without hesitation, he knelt down, ignoring the blast of cold air that rushed into his home. The dog lifted its head slightly, looking at him with exhausted but trusting eyes. There was intelligence in that gaze, and something more, a plea for help, not just for himself but for his tiny companion. Mark quickly assessed the situation, his mind running through the first aid protocols he'd used countless times before. Both animals were suffering from severe hypothermia and needed immediate attention. With gentle but efficient movements, he lifted both animals together, careful not to separate them, as the dog seemed distressed whenever he tried. Inside, Mark quickly gathered supplies, towels, blankets, and his old heating pad. He cleared off his coffee table and created a makeshift examination area. The kitten was in worse shape, her body temperature dangerously low. Mark wrapped her in a heated towel, keeping her close to the dog, who seemed equally concerned about her welfare. As he worked to warm them up, Mark's mind raced through his options. The local vet's office would be closed at this hour, and the roads were too dangerous to attempt driving to the emergency animal hospital in the next town. They would have to make it through the night here, and he would have to draw upon everything he knew about treating hypothermia. Over the next few hours, Mark worked tirelessly to save the unlikely pair. He used warm towels, carefully regulated heating pads, and even his own body heat to slowly bring their temperatures up to safer levels. The dog, despite his own condition, remained focused on the kitten, gently nuzzling her whenever she made the slightest sound. As the night wore on, Mark found himself talking to them, something he hadn't done since Sarah passed away. He told them about his years as a firefighter, about Sarah, about the loneliness of retirement. The dog watched him with intelligent eyes, occasionally wagging his tail weakly, while the kitten slowly began to show signs of improvement. "You're quite the hero, aren't you, boy?" Mark said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Saving this little one like that reminds me of some rescues I've been part of." The dog's tail thumped against the blanket, and for the first time in hours, Mark allowed himself to hope that both animals would survive. By dawn, The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a transformed world of pristine white. The dog and kitten had made it through the critical period, though both were still weak. Mark had managed to get some water and small amounts of food into them, using tuna from his pantry for the kitten and some leftover chicken for the dog. As morning light filtered through his windows, Mark called the local veterinary clinic. Dr. Jessica Chen, who had treated Sarah's cats years ago, answered personally despite the early hour. After hearing Mark's description of the situation, she promised to come by as soon as the roads were cleared enough to travel. While waiting for the vet, Mark observed the remarkable bond between his two unexpected guests. The dog, who he had started calling Buddy based on his friendly nature, kept careful watch over the kitten. The kitten, in turn, seemed to draw comfort from Buddy's presence, staying close to him even as she began to explore her new surroundings with wobbly steps. Dr. Chen arrived mid-morning, her four-wheel drive vehicle managing the snow-covered streets. She listened intently as Mark described finding them and his efforts through the night. Her examination confirmed that both animals were suffering from hypothermia, dehydration, and exposure, but thanks to Mark's quick action and care, they would recover. The puppy's about 6 months old, she explained, checking Buddy's paw pads. He's got some minor frostbite on his paws, but with proper treatment, he should heal completely. The kitten's younger, maybe 8 weeks. She's lucky to be alive. Another hour out there, and we'd be having a very different conversation. As Dr. Chen treated their injuries and administered fluids, she noticed something else. This puppy has a microchip, she said, running the scanner over Buddy again. I can look up the information when I get back to the clinic. Mark felt a sudden pang of disappointment. Of course, Buddy might have a family looking for him. It was the right thing to do, checking the microchip, but in the few short hours since he'd found them, Mark had already begun to feel attached to both animals. Dr. Chen left them with medication, special food, and strict instructions for their care. She promised to call as soon as she had information about Buddy's microchip. Mark spent the rest of the day tending to his patients, who were slowly regaining their strength. The kitten, whom he'd started calling Daisy because of her delicate nature, began showing more personality, batting at Buddy's tail when he wagged it and exploring the living room with increasing confidence. Late that afternoon, Dr. Chen called with news about the microchip. Buddy had originally belonged to a family who had been forced to surrender him to the local shelter due to financial hardship. He had been adopted by another family 2 months ago, but they had reported him missing 3 days earlier. However, when Dr. Chen contacted them, they seemed hesitant about reclaiming him. They admitted they'd been keeping him outside most of the time. Dr. Chen explained, disapproval clear in her voice. When I described the condition we found him in, they agreed it might be better if he found a new home. They've signed surrender papers. Mark felt a wave of relief, followed by a moment of clarity. What about adoption papers? He heard himself asking. For both of them? The next few weeks passed in a blur of veterinary visits, recovery milestones, and gradual adjustments to life with pets. Mark's quiet house transformed into a home filled with energy and life. Buddy's paws healed, and he proved to be an intelligent, gentle dog with a particular talent for knowing when Mark needed companionship. Daisy grew into a playful, affectionate cat who divided her time between wrestling with Buddy and claiming Mark's lap as her personal domain. The bond between Buddy and Daisy remained extraordinary. They slept curled up together, played gentle games of chase, and seemed to communicate in their own special way. Mark often found himself watching them with amazement, reminded of the night he'd found them and marveling at how close he'd come to missing this chance at a new family. Word of their story spread through Cedar Falls. The local newspaper ran a feature about the rescue, complete with photos of Buddy and Daisy playing in Mark's backyard. The article highlighted the remarkable instincts of the young dog who had saved a kitten's life, and the retired firefighter who had saved them both. The story touched people's hearts, and soon Mark found himself receiving visitors. Neighbors he'd barely spoken to before, fellow retirees seeking connection, even families with children who wanted to meet the heroic dog and his kitten friend. His house, once a quiet refuge that had felt more like a museum of memories, became a place of warmth and community. Mark's children noticed the change in their father during their video calls. He smiled more, had stories to share, and seemed more engaged with life. His daughter, Emily, finally managed to visit that spring, and she was amazed by the transformation she saw in both the house and her father. "Dad," she said one evening, watching as he sat in his armchair with Daisy purring in his lap while Buddy dozed at his feet, "I haven't seen you this happy since Mom passed." Mark reached down to scratch Buddy's ears, considering her words. "You know, your mother always wanted a dog," he said softly. "I think she would have loved these too. Sometimes I wonder if she had something to do with sending them my way that night." As spring turned to summer, Mark created a small memorial garden in his backyard, planting Sarah's favorite flowers, daisies, of course, and setting up a comfortable bench where he could sit and watch Buddy and Daisy play. The garden became his place to feel close to Sarah while embracing his new life, a perfect blend of remembrance and renewal. One year after that fateful blizzard night, Mark hosted a small celebration at his home. Dr. Chen was there, along with some of his former firefighter colleagues, neighbors, and both his children, who had flown in for the occasion. They celebrated not just the survival of 2 animals, but the creation of a family and the renewal of a man's spirit. As Mark watched Buddy and Daisy perform their usual entertaining antics for the guests, Buddy showing off his new tricks while Daisy helped by pouncing on his wagging tail, he reflected on how close he'd come to missing this chance at happiness. If he hadn't heard that faint scratch at his door, if he hadn't followed his instinct to open it despite the late hour and brutal weather, 3 lives would have been lost that night. Buddy's, Daisy's, and in a different but equally real way, his own. The story of Buddy, Daisy, and Mark became something of a legend in Cedar Falls, retold every winter when the snow began to fall. It reminded people that hope can appear in the most unexpected moments, that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes the family you need finds you when you least expect it but most need it. Mark eventually started volunteering at the local animal shelter, sharing his experience and helping other potential adopters find their own perfect matches. Buddy accompanied him sometimes, wearing his therapy dog certification with pride, showing other rescued animals that second chances were possible and that happy endings could come from the darkest beginnings. Daisy, for her part, remained the princess of the household, dividing her time between supervising Buddy's activities, accepting admirers' attention with regal grace, and reminding Mark several times daily that dinner should be served precisely on time. She never grew to be a large cat, perhaps due to her rough start in life, but she had enough personality for 3 cats her size. On quiet evenings, when the 3 of them settled into their familiar positions, Mark in his chair, Daisy in his lap, and Buddy at his feet, Mark would sometimes think about the strange paths that had brought them together. A series of misfortunes, his loss of Sarah, Buddy's abandonment, Daisy's dangerous beginning, had somehow combined to create something beautiful and healing for all of them. The house on Maple Street was no longer just a structure filled with memories of what had been lost. It had become a home again, filled with new memories, new love, and the kind of joy that can only come from giving life a second chance. In saving each other that cold winter night, Buddy, Daisy, and Mark had discovered that family isn't always about who you start with, but who you choose to love and protect along the way. And so their story continues, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of unlikely friendships, and the endless capacity of the heart to heal and grow when given the chance to love again. In Cedar Falls, Minnesota, where winters are long and sometimes cruel, people still talk about the night when a brave puppy, a tiny kitten, and a lonely man found each other through a blizzard. As years passed, their bond only grew stronger. Buddy developed a remarkable intuition for when other animals needed help. More than once, Mark found himself being led by an insistent Buddy to another creature in distress, a trapped rabbit, an injured bird, or a lost cat. Each time, Mark would help however he could, remembering that cold night when he'd opened his door to 2 desperate souls. Daisy, despite her diminutive size, became the neighborhood's unofficial welcoming committee. She would often be seen sitting in the window, watching the street with keen interest, and somehow always knowing when a new neighbor needed a friendly greeting. Families moving in would often find themselves visited by a small, confident cat who seemed to be conducting an inspection of their property. The garden Mark had planted in Sarah's memory flourished, becoming a sanctuary not just for him, but for the whole neighborhood. He added benches and created winding paths among the flowers, and soon it became a place where people would gather on warm evenings to share stories and watch Buddy and Daisy's ongoing adventures. Mark's children noticed another change in their father. He began writing. At first, it was just notes about Buddy and Daisy's daily activities, but gradually it evolved into something more. He started writing stories about their rescue and the many ways they changed his life. These stories found their way to local schools, where teachers used them to teach children about compassion, courage, and the special bond between humans and animals. As Buddy matured into a dignified adult dog, his gentle nature and intelligence made him an ideal therapy dog. Together with Mark, he began visiting local hospitals and nursing homes. Patients would light up at the sight of the friendly Labrador, and Mark found himself sharing their story again and again, watching as it brought hope to people facing their own struggles. The story of that blizzard night became more than just a tale of survival. It became a reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope can find us if we're brave enough to open the door when it scratches. In Cedar Falls, whenever winter storms approach and the wind begins to howl, people think of a puppy who refused to leave a kitten behind, and a man who found the courage to begin again. And in a warm house on Maple Street, 3 hearts beat as one, each grateful for the night when fate and compassion came together to create a family that was meant to be.